Today we're going to talk about general value. As you can see, the essential question is, what does value do to any object a person draws? As before, it's encouraged to take some Cornell notes along with what we are discussing in case there are any quizzes about terms or techniques that you may need to know later. The learning targets for this unit are: I understand the 5 value techniques and can apply them in a value scale in my sketchbook with strong craftsmanship, which means skill or neatness. I can apply the value techniques in a drawing of simple objects in value in my sketchbook with strong craftsmanship, so the drawing looks completely focused and that make the original outlines disappear. The simple object drawings will include a table edge and shadow to show where the objects are in space. So considering value, I'm wondering what the definition of value is and what value does to objects. So I want you to think about that for a minute, and I'll reveal the answers in a moment. Here you can see the definition of value is the lightness or darkness of a color, the whitest whites, the blackest blacks, and all the grays in between. In addition to that, value gives objects in a drawing the illusion of form so that they look 3D, which means it almost feels like you can pick them up off the page. So when we talked about media, we had talked about this before. Media means that there's different materials for different types of art. In 2D, you can see there's lots of different medias listed here, and there are some listed for the 3D medias as well. Like before, we are going to talk about the design process. Right now we're in the thinking mode. Eventually we'll start making the value scales and the value drawings that we had talked about, and then we're going to talk about what you might need to do to improve those. And again, that design process is a cyclical process where you're going to go back and forth between different modes in order to create the best work possible. The toolkit you received should contain 2 ebony pencils, a white vinyl eraser, a pencil sharpener, a blending stump, and a kneaded eraser. If anybody's missing anything, the teacher can get you things. Just let this presentation finish, write down what the object is that you need, and then we'll go and get those a little bit later. So you might have used ebony pencil in the last assignment, and that's fine. But again, anytime you create a drawing in a different media, you should always create some sort of value scale on a piece of scrap paper or in your sketchbook so that you see how those different media react. Not only doing it in your sketchbook, but doing it on a specific paper choice. Some of the papers in the classroom are black or brown or even different colors, so you might want to try them on the different colored papers as well. I'm wondering if you guys remember what the longest part of the 4-step drawing process is from the last unit. If you said it was value, you were correct. Let's review it again just to make sure that we're clear. So the 4-step drawing process again is seeing and shape finding together. Really they're steps 1 and 2, but often I talk about how they're done together. You have to really observe what you're trying to draw, and you're going to have to use negative spaces and measure the different angles and sizes between different objects in order to draw them well. I often also call this blocking in, which needs to be done very lightly with a pencil. Step 3 is major value changes, and as you can see, it is the longest part of the 4-step drawing process. It's where you're going to create different values to make the objects look more 3D. The last step in the 4-step drawing process is doing details like lines in feathers, or the line between the beak and the bird, or perhaps the shadow underneath the bird. Just so that you are aware, when you use the 4-step drawing process, you're actually going to have a higher success rate in your drawings. And I would also highly suggest that you try different value techniques so that you have different options of creating value. Smudging is one of the techniques, and many of you like it because it creates photorealistic drawings. However, it does take a lot of time to do that, and there will be a trial and error process of you getting it right. So sometimes you have to let go of wanting something to be photorealistic, and you can use the other value techniques to break yourself free of that photorealism push. When you create details on the edges of objects, it's really important that you use a super sharp pencil. In this case, it's going to be a number 2 or ebony pencil that you're going to be using to create those crisp edges between different objects in your drawings. Now we're going to move on to the different value techniques. As we had discussed before, smudging is the first one, where you're going to use your finger, a tissue, an eraser, or a blending stump to rub the piece of paper to create values or different values. And as you can see in that image in the upper right, there are some super light grays and there are darker grays where the person added more pencil and then rubbed again to get those darker values. The second value technique is line rendering, and again, that's using parallel lines to create value. You can do it vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. The third value technique is cross-hatching, where you're using perpendicular lines to create values, and just like the line rendering, when you put the cross-hatched marks closer together, the values get darker, as you can see in that upper right image. Value technique number 4 is stippling, or it's also called pointillism, where you're using dots to create value. It does take the longest to create value this way, so it's suggested that you stay away from that with pen or pencil because it will take you longer than you have for the project, most likely, unless you take things home or come in for enrichment a lot. The number 5 value technique is scumbling. You can see here it's using the side of your pencil or scribbling to create value. The image on the lower right shows scribbled values with a pencil. I'm just wondering if you guys think that there's a value technique that's better than others. So here I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask what you guys think about that. If we're looking at the value techniques that are exhibited here, I'm wondering if you can figure out which one is not evident in this picture. If you said smudging, you are correct. Another thing I want to mention as we're talking about this is when we're blocking in, there are different videos that you can use about how to block in what you're trying to do. When we actually draw the cylinder and box in value, what you're going to be doing is you're going to have to actually draw those or attempt to draw them by yourself without printing or tracing this time. That is so that you get used to trying to draw things free-handed. We will actually be tracing the value scale that you're going to be doing. You can see there's a stepped and gradated value video. There's one for cylinder, there's one for box, and there will be one coming for the bag as well. Now we need to talk about the requirements for the value assignment. The first one is that you have to complete the value worksheet so that you practice stepped and gradated values before you use them on an object. This will actually make the process easier, and you'll also be able to see the differences between where you are missing certain values in your drawings if you create this worksheet. The second thing you're going to be doing is creating a cylinder in value so that you understand how to create a cylindrical form and make it look 3D with enough contrast to see the object, the shadows, and the table. You will also be doing that for either a box or a bag in value to understand again how to make a flat surface look three-dimensional on a piece of paper. The bag is actually harder to do for those who already draw really well. Again, you can use any value technique to create your drawings provided that you finish on time. So again, it's suggested that you stay away from stippling. So as much as we're just going to do a cylinder and a box or bag in value, we need to talk about spherical objects as well because they do exist in real life. Here you can see on the sphere the differences between where the light source is, where the shadows are, and where there's a cast shadow. You can even see that there's a reflection from the table bouncing up onto that ball, creating a lighter spot on the bottom portion of that ball. The reflection is especially important because it's how light bounces off of objects. We're going to study that even more when we get into color. The next slide shows you how light reacts with objects in space. So this is actually showing you a picture from the universe. So you can see the sun and then you can see the moon and where the different shadows are being caused by the light source that is the sun. This actually happens on the tables in the classrooms as well. When we have one light source hitting an object, you will see the umbra, which is the very darkest shadow, and you'll normally also see the penumbra, which is the second darkest shadow that you see there. Sometimes there will be an anti-umbra, but that's a little bit more difficult to see, and we often don't have a bright enough light source to make that work. So, considering the highlight, reflection, and shadow, what do you think is most important when creating value in an object? As much as all of those things are very important, one of the things that's going to make any object you draw stand out is when you create a shadow with what you are doing. Here we're going to talk about the stepped value scale. As you can see, it's numbered from 0 to 9, and technically it's really hard to see the value on number 1, but there is a tiny bit of value in that. So we had talked about what the toolkit you received should contain. Technically, you should have 2 ebony pencils, a white vinyl eraser, a pencil sharpener, a blending stump, and a kneaded eraser. If anybody's missing anything, the teacher can get you things. Just let this presentation finish, write down what the object is that you need, and then we'll go and get those a little bit later. As you can see here, it's recommended that you trace your value scale worksheet into your sketchbook. Here we're going to talk about the stepped value scale. As you can see, it's numbered from 0 to 9, and technically it's really hard to see the value on number 1, but there is a tiny bit of value in that square. That's why I put a 0 beyond that, where there's nothing on the paper whatsoever. You do actually have to put a little value in number 1, and there will be examples in the classroom for you to see that you can compare your work to in order to accomplish that. What you should also see is that the values get a little bit darker as you move from one step to another. When I talk about doing the stepped value scale, I normally suggest making number 9 first and taking value from number 9 to create the lightest values with a tissue or your blending stump. I often use a tissue or my finger and erase around the edges. It's a little bit easier because you can press a little bit too hard with the blending stump when you use that. Here you can see the other value scales that have been created. The one on the top says tonal, but what it actually is a scumbled value scale because they're using the side of the pencil to create that. Then you'll see in the middle there's a cross-hatched value scale where there's lines that are perpendicular to each other or cross in order to create the value, and then the bottom one is actually stippling. So we're actually missing the line rendered value and the smudged value on this particular example. What I also want you to see is the difference in value between this and the slide that we had before. So I'm just going to go back here so that you can see how dark you really should be able to get, specifically number 9. On this value scale, this is also a slight problem because there's not enough value in number 1, and all of the progressive steps are also not dark enough. There shouldn't be such a large step between step 8 and 9. Realistically, number 6 should actually be number 5, and then 7 should be 6, 8 should be 7, and 8 should actually be a little bit darker, closer to what 9 actually looks like. Here is an example that you can see that's completed where you can see the stepped value and the gradated or blended value. But what I want you to notice about the stepped value is that it's not actually stepped. What this person did is they took ebony pencil in number 9 and then they rubbed it across to get the lighter values. The problem with that is when you're actually creating your cylinder and your box examples, you won't be able to see the difference between what values you're missing because, for example, on this stepped value scale, you can see number 1, number 2, and almost number 3 look almost exactly the same, and half of number 3 looks like number 4. And again, it's because the person did not do them individually the way that they were supposed to. Again, I normally suggest starting with the number 9 value and then stealing from number 9 to create values in numbers 1 through about 4, but realistically by the time you get to numbers 3 and number 4, you're going to have to take a number 2 pencil to make them dark enough to see. Again, this person did not really do a very good job on keeping them stepped. They actually smudged it across the numbers, and you can see that when you compare it to the different ones in the classroom. Now, I know this is a little silly, but in a way, we're kind of creating magic with drawings because you're going to have an outline, and the whole idea behind what we're doing with value is trying to make the outlines disappear. So you're kind of like a magician. It's kind of cool. So I'm just wondering if you remember why it's important to create the value scale in each media before you start different drawings. I don't think I actually talked about that, but I'm wondering what you're thinking. Anytime you create a drawing in a different media, you should always create some sort of value scale on a piece of scrap paper or in your sketchbook so that you see how those different media react. Not only doing it in your sketchbook, but doing it on a specific paper choice. Some of the papers in the classroom are black or brown or even different colors. So you might want to try them on the different colored papers as well. All right, there are some other general things you need to know about value before I actually release you to go and try this in your sketchbook. One thing that you need to understand about value is it has to be created in layers. Ogres have layers, onions have layers, and value has layers. Yeah, I know, it's a really stupid dad joke, but literally, you have to create value in layers. You want to start light and work your way progressively darker so that you don't make mistakes. That being said, a lot of times I'll tell people to do the background or the darkest shadow first so that you can steal some of that value to create the lighter values within the drawing itself. You kind of have to figure out what works for you. I'll give you some tips, and then again, as you actually work for yourself, you're going to figure out what works for you. But again, the key here is that value should be done in layers. Here you can see the blocked in version of the horse on the left. The middle version actually has a little bit more value added to it where you can see a little bit of the mane. And then the image all the way on the right is really, really well done. You can actually see the nose of the horse because of the value that they put in the background. However, that person should have done a little bit more into the background of the horse, perhaps behind the head, like on the top of the mane and right beyond that left ear, so that it really tied the entire drawing together. Only putting that little bit beyond the nose is creating a different kind of a problem where you can see that the person did not really finish the drawing. Another thing that you need to be aware of is you're going to have to add and subtract value to make your drawing work. You're not going to be able to just add it in one place and think that you're going to be done. You're going to have to add it in multiple places. Step back, take a look at it, and then see if you have to make some changes. You may have to go and erase some areas, or you may have to add more value. Another thing that I want you to realize is that going in an elliptical or a circular motion is going to create the smoothest value for you as well. So I know I just talked about this, but why are we adding and subtracting values to create your drawings? That's right. They're going to look the most realistic if you actually do that. And then again, stepping back from them and taking a look at them as you're doing it, putting your drawing up on the countertop and walking away from it without looking at it, and then turning around and looking back at it, you'll actually see where the flaws in the drawing are. And your teacher can help you see those as well. When we're talking about value, we did talk about how that elliptical motion is going to get you the most realistic or smooth blending. However, you also need to think about how you're holding your pencil. Most of you, when you write, you're going to hold your pencil like the image that's on the right. That is not how we want to use the pencil when we are trying to create value for drawing. When you're trying to create value, you actually want to hold the pencil back much farther. The reason for that is it's much harder to press really hard with the pencil when you do that. So the whole point is to not create too much value on the paper. When you're trying to create those really light layers, you have to hold the pencil back farther so that you can't push so hard on the pencil that you create problems. Another thing that I want to talk to you guys about is the orientation of your sketchbook. As you can see here, this person flipped their sketchbook around in order to get closer to an area of the edge of the cylinder to fill in the table value to get it closer so there wasn't a white outline around the cylinder. You are going to have to flip your sketchbook around as you try to get different areas so that you don't accidentally make the value blurry in an area where it needs to stay sharp and crisp to make the whole drawing really look focused. For now, it's suggested that you stay away from the blending stump and the kneaded eraser. If you haven't used those before, you might need a demo from the teacher in person. As much as we can talk about the different ways to use different utensils, it's important to get an in-person demo on the blending stump and the kneaded eraser, because you might need the teacher to actually put their hand on yours in order to show you the amount of pressure that you're going to need to use in order to use those different utensils appropriately. Getting well-developed and smudged value can be done with a tissue, your finger, or the blending stump. All right, so now I'm wondering what some of the recommendations were for creating value. So the next few slides are going to talk about how value is created in light layers. Here you can see the object has been blocked in with the shadow. Again, the person is drawing very lightly, just trying to get the outlines of where different values and the shadow are. In this next slide, you can see the person started adding some value on the sphere. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend creating a line like this. You might not be able to get rid of that later, but this does actually show you the next step where you're going to add a little bit of value in that sphere. The next part you can see here, the person actually added a little bit darker value in that back section, again, because the light source is in the upper left, meaning that the right side of that sphere would get darker. You can see that happening here. Then they actually went and they blended things together. So they either took a tissue, their finger, or a blending stump to blend those different values together. And you can see they even added a little bit of a darker area in the upper left, opposite the highlight, which is that lightest part in the sphere that you can see. Notice that they also must have gone back with their eraser to erase the edges to make the sphere as nice as possible. As you can see, the person went back in here and they started to create the shadow, adding a really dark value right underneath that sphere with a super sharp pencil. And then they went back and they actually blended the values in the shadows a little bit more so that you can really see the umbra, which is the darkest part of the shadow, and the penumbra, which is that second or lighter shadow. You're actually seeing a couple of different shadows here because this person must not have had only one light source on their sphere. One other question I want to ask you is, I'm wondering if you notice between this and the examples that are in the classroom, what is missing from this drawing? If you said a table line and the background, you are correct. So if we're actually thinking of a blended value on objects, what we're trying to do is we're trying to eliminate all of the original outlines. So here on this second cylinder, the one in the middle, I've actually blown up the section that you need to really take a look at, because you can see that the person did not completely get rid of the outlines between the object, which is the cylinder, the reflection, which is in the table, and then again, the cylindrical arc on the bottom of the cylinder to the table. There shouldn't be a line there. It should be distinguished all by values. Therefore, the example that's on the left here is actually much better because you don't see any outlines at all. I know you're probably wondering why we're practicing these smaller objects. You know, a cylinder in a box, not too exciting. But what you need to be aware of is that we're going to be creating bigger drawings in class, and you are going to be expected to be able to add value to those drawings. Not money value, but you're going to actually create the light or dark values in order to represent different parts of your environment. So here you can actually see a water fountain and the display case that's over by the theater area for the perspective drawing that you're going to be doing later. So here are some examples of what you should be learning in this class. If you could do a portrait like the one on the left, by the time we're done with this class, you should be able to do something sort of like the one on the right. Technically, we do portraiture and drawing too, but hopefully you get my idea. If you are able to do a drawing that has some sort of value like the one on the left, your value should improve like the one on the right. Here's another example of a person that did a drawing before the class and then after this class. You can see how much contrast they were able to add, and it really enhanced that drawing. Even though the woman in that image on the right isn't very attractive, you see what I'm getting at. Those darker, deeper values are necessary to create a lot of drama in your drawings, which is what we want. Here there's another example of a portrait, but what I want you to realize here is in things like the eyebrows and the mustache and beard, what the person did is they used the very sharp pencil for the eyebrow and eyelashes, and they used a really sharp pencil eraser to create the values that are in the white part of the beard. because you're going to actually have to go back and forth between a sharp pencil and a really nice edged eraser in order to get values like that. One other thing that I want to caution you about is you're going to possibly create issues in your drawing sometimes when you create the highlights. So you will have to go back in with a super sharp pencil or a blending stump in order to make different parts of the drawing evident. Here you can see it's hard to see the edge of the glass from the liquid that's in the glass, and it's also really hard to see the edge of the glass that's on the left-hand side because the person should have put a little bit more value in there. And again, this is why we want to step back from our work so that we can see where there are problems so that you can really address all of those and really level up what you are trying to do when you are drawing. As a reminder, you should be taking process photos as we're going along here. So the example that's on the right, it's a really good example of the box, but the cylinder probably should have been taken before it was as far as it is because there isn't much of a difference between the two cylinders. So really, the person should have taken the process photo more when they were blocked in. At this point, I'm going to let you start tracing the value scale into your sketchbook and starting that if you are ready for that. And we will talk more specifically about the cylinder and box in the coming class periods.